Welcome back everybody to another Count Life episode about the candidates 2021 highlights. Today we had an amazing day with 4 decisive results. First time in the history of the candidates that all results are decisive. This is unprecedented, and as chess fans we had an amazing feast today. The games I'm going to be watching are, first of all, the one that you're going to see in this video, and this is the decisive game of the round, the one between Fabiano Caruana and Anish Giri. Fabiano Caruana was 1 point behind Jan Nepomniachtchi, who is the leader. Anish Giri was half a point behind the leader going into this round. Nevertheless, Anish Giri has the worst tiebreaks, and this is extremely important to remember. He has the worst tiebreaks against Jan Nepomniachtchi, so he doesn't only have to equal in terms of points by the end of the tournament, but he actually has to surpass Jan Nepomniachtchi in order to be the challenger for the World Championship. So Anish Giri definitely in almost a must-win situation, just like Fabiano Caruana, who was in a must-win situation as well. These are the ingredients for a very successful matchup. Let's see what happened. Fabiano Caruana decides to start the game with e4. We have c5 on the board, knight to f3, a6, and I would say this is the first surprise of the game, and actually a very important one, because we've seen Anish play the move knight to c6 and potentially entering in the Sveshnikov after d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight to f6, knight to c3, e5. We've seen this played out in the first game since the resumption of the candidates, the one between the leader Jan Nepomniachtchi and Anish. And Anish definitely didn't have any problems in that game. Now, the problem with this move order, after playing knight to c6, white has extra options. And in 2018, between Fabiano Caruana, the match between Fabiano Caruana and Magnus Carlsen for the World Championship title, we've seen a lot of bishop b5 being played by Fabiano Caruana. So if as black you are worried about the Rossolimo and what that entitles, then you would try to find a way to avoid it. And I think this is why Anish Giri decided to start with the move e6. We will see some very interesting transpositions in the opening later on. d4 was immediately played by Fabiano, c takes d4, knight takes d4, and knight to f6, attacking the pawn on e4. This is pretty standard. Knight to c3, knight to c6, and this is a key position in this opening. First of all, white's main option in this instance is to go the move knight to b5, knight d to b5, threatening to go knight to d6 with a check and disrupting black's position. Black at this point has 2 main options, and I would assume that in this position Anish Giri would have went for the very principal option, and that is the move d6. And after bishop to f4, e5, bishop to g5, now we actually have a transposition to the Sveshnikov variation after a6, knight to a3, d5, and now of course white can go bishop takes f6, or he can go knight to d5. It's a very standard position, but this is not something that Fabiano was ready to embrace. He wanted to avoid this type of Sveshnikov main lines. So Anish definitely was very, very smart with his move order. Also, at this point, black has an extra option of playing bishop b4, but that is out of our scope because I really do not think that Anish was going to go for that. Now, Fabiano decides to avoid the Sveshnikov, and he plays this move a3. I would argue that this is a slight concession because, of course, a3 prevents the move bishop to b4 and this pin on the knight on c3. Bishop to e7, bishop to e3. Now we have very standard position. The problem is that this pawn is already on a3, and in potential attacks on opposite side castles, black's attack is going to come quite nicely after the move a6, b5, and then we're going to hook this pawn on a3. So as I was mentioning before, a3 is a slight concession for white. Castle, bishop to e2. White is showing his cards. He's going to be ready to castle short side. d6, queen to d3, and this is the novelty in this game. Fabiano was definitely surprised by Anish's opening choice, and he decided to find a fresh position very, very early on in the opening and just get a very normal play, a fighting game, but all very original. Queen to d3, bishop to d7, f4 was being played, e5, immediately counterattacking in the center, knight takes c6, b takes c6, a very interesting decision by Anish. He could have also taken with the bishop, but it seems like taking with the pawn and controlling this very important square d5, as well as potentially putting some pressure on the b file, seems to be like the right plan for black. Castle was played, e takes f4, bishop takes f4, and now we see the battle of pros and cons of this change in structure. For white, the pro is definitely that this bishop can now attack the pawn on d6. For black, of course, the opening of the e file and the potential attack on the weakness, for the moment, the weakness, the pawn on e4. So we see pros and cons for both sides. But this was an interesting decision by Anish to just simply take on f4. Bishop to e6, queen to g3, knight to d7, rook to d1. Of course, if you venture and take this pawn, after bishop takes d6, queen takes d6, black is just simply going to be able to throw in a check. That's a check to the king, as well as an attack on the pawn on b2. I'm going to get my pawn back, and the position is going to be very, very good for black. So, of course, white decides to go rook to d1. He's not ready to allow those type of complications. Rook to e8, king to h1, queen to b8, a very important move. Queen to b8 attacking the pawn on b2, at the same time defending this pawn on d6. And this is a critical juncture in this game, because white decides to go for a very enterprising plan, but I would assume a bit overly optimistic. He played the move b4. I think the much more cautious approach with b3 would have definitely been the right way of playing this one. First of all, this b2 pawn is never this b pawn is never going to be weak anymore, because the c2 pawn is going to defend it at all times. We're probably going to create this pawn chain c2, b3, a4. That's going to be very stable, and then slowly we will focus our attention on this pawn on d6, maybe even a maneuver such as knight to b1 and get the knight to c4. I have a lot of options as white. It's going to be a slower game than what we've seen in the actual game. Nevertheless, white maintains the authority in the position after b3. Instead of that, he played the move b4, which I don't necessarily like. Nevertheless, it's a very enterprising plan, as we will see. Knight to e5 and immediately b5, and this goes to show that Fabiano had a very original thinking whenever he chose this plan. This doesn't look like a good idea for white. You're completely shattering your pawn structure, but in fact you're also getting a very important square, and that is the square d5. Nevertheless, I have to say I don't agree with this plan. Rook to c8. You're also allowing the rook, which on e8, sure, it was on a semi-open file, and potentially if all these pieces disappear, then it will have a role in attacking the pawn on e4. But it was pretty far away from accomplishing that. Now with the rook on c8, I'm simply ready to attack on the c file. So we're kind of helping black find roles for his pieces. Rook to c8, b takes c6 was played, rook takes c6, knight to d5, knight jumps in the center, queen to f8. This is a very important move. Not only that you're defending this bishop on e7, you're signaling the fact that you're not worried about giving the bishop pair. This knight on d5 is much more precious than this bishop on e7. So this move might have came as a shock for Fabiano. Also, a big problem, as I was mentioning, all of black's pieces are now having very, very active roles. The rook on c6 is attacking on the c file, but also this rook, after the move of the queen to f8, is ready to jump to c8, double up with his partner on c6, and the c2 pawn is going to become a huge weakness. And white simply just lacks an active plan at this moment. It has a beautiful piece on d5, but outside of that, not much more. He played the move c3, running out of ideas a little bit, Fabiano that is, with the white pieces. Rook to c1, knight to g6, a bishop to d2, a bishop to h4, queen to e3, and now rook to c5, attacking the knight on d5. I really like this move. Not only that you're attacking the knight on d5 and you're forcing a reaction out of your opponent, but you're also removing this rook from c6 to a much better square. A nice defended outpost on c5. Knight b4 no longer comes with tempo. Potentially if this queen and the bishop are removed from the defense of this e7 square, knight e7 also doesn't come with tempo on the rook on c6. So I overall think that the rook on c5 is just simply much better place. Also, it comes with tempo, and this is crucial. Anish so far, and for the rest of the game as we will see, has played an amazing precise game. Rook to c5, c4, h6, another very important move. Giving a luft for the king, ready to go to h7, no more back problem for black, as well as an extra square for the bishop to go to g5 and create some damage, potentially exchange this dark square bishop, which will help black, because once we achieve that, as we will see in the game, we're going to be able to utilize this square on e5 and overall the dark squares much more freely. And this is exactly what Anish was gunning for. Queen to b3, bishop to g5, immediately going for the exchange of the bishops. Bishop takes g5, h takes g5, queen to g3, coming back to attack the pawn on g5 as well as keep an eye on the pawn on d6. The problem is that after queen to d8, rook to d1, bishop takes d5, a very important move. Now, we understand what was Anish's plan for the last 5 to 10 moves, and that was to exchange all the pieces except this bishop and the knight. Now we have a position with a good knight, an excellent knight that's going to go in the center and is going to control either on e5, either on f4, supported by the pawn on g5. We know that knights, when they have outposts, and in this case you have two very strong outposts, they're very strong. The bishop, on the other hand, is tied to the defense of the pawn c4. It doesn't have any targets in the position. It doesn't play a crucial defensive role either, so it's just a bad piece. We have a very curious case of a good knight versus a bad bishop, very bad bishop. E takes d5. From a strategic point of view, from this point on, black is completely winning. Knight to f4, queen to f2, rook to c7. Anish is exhibiting a lot of patience, improving the quality of all of his pieces. This rook on c7 is defending the pawn on c7, on a7, excuse me, and it's also on a dark square. He really likes having his pieces on dark square because the bishop will never be able to attack those pieces. A rook to d4, queen to e8, bishop f3, and now Fabiano decides that it's time to give up a pawn, try to free himself up a little bit, because otherwise he would just be suffocated by black's pressure on dark squares. Rook takes c4, rook takes c4, rook takes c4, queen takes a7, and now a rook to a4, creating this double attack on the queen and the pawn on a3, and black showcases his dominance. Queen to f2. At this point, Fabiano pretty much had his last chance to kind of create any sort of counter chances, and those counter chances would have came after the move queen to c7. And we see that it's very important to kind of keep an eye on potentially giving up a check somewhere on the back rank if the queen starts moving away. Also attack the pawn on c7. From a practical perspective, unfortunately, the reasons for Fabiano not playing this move could be tied to the fact that he was very low on time. So he was playing on increment right now. He was just trying to make time control, and This is move 36, so he still had 5 moves left until time control. Queen c7 is not an easy decision to make, mostly because, of course, you keep the queen attacking a pawn, but at the same time, you're also keeping the queen a little bit too far away from your own king. So potentially, you could have some defensive problems because of that. He decided to go queen to f2. Unfortunately, this just allows black to take on a3. This is going to be a pawn up. Also, black has the better pieces. It's only a matter of time until the game will be over at this point. h4, queen to e5, h takes g5, queen takes g5. Now the king is also open, so very prone to attacks on the h file. Rook to e1, rook to a8, bishop to e4, rook to a2, rook to b1, a very nice move. Of course, white cannot take the rook on a2, is prohibited, because after queen to h4, king to g1, queen takes e1, king to h2, I can just simply pick up all of your pieces. Queen takes e4. Now I'm on knight up, and the position is just simply completely lost. Rook to b1, a nice cute tactic by white. Of course, black is not going to take the queen on f2. Checkmate on the back rank would come. So black decides to go rook a8 back, rook to e1 back, and now continue with this move f5, a very powerful decision by black, getting ready to go king to f7, make space for the rook to go to the h file, and that's just going to be lights off for the white king. Bishop to b1, king to f7, rook to e3, rook to h8, check, king to g1, and now a very beautiful finish. Knight takes g2, of course taking advantage of the fact that this queen cannot defend both the pawn on g2 and the rook on e3. If you take on g2, queen takes e3 comes, and the game is over. A brilliant game by black, Anish Giri that is. Anish, going into this round, was half a point behind the leader Jan Nepomniachtchi. It looked at one point in the middle of this game, while he was piling up the pressure on Fabiano, it looked as if after this round he could potentially tie with Jan Nepomniachtchi going into the final 2 games. Unfortunately for him, Jan also won his game, and you can check that game in a different video. Jan also won his game, and he maintains the lead, the half a point lead going into the final 2 games. And as a reminder, Anish Giri has the worst tie, well, he has bad tie breaks in relation to Jan Nepomniachtchi. And so even if he manages to catch up that half a point in the last 2 rounds, it's not going to be enough because of bad tie breaks. In order to become the candidate and challenge Magnus Carlsen, Anish Giri has to score 1 point more than Jan Nepomniachtchi in the final 2 rounds. It's going to be a very, very tense finale, but I'm very excited to see what's going to happen in the last 2 rounds.